is the Workplace Relations Minister, Tony Burke. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good to be here.
I think I can guess this, but what's your New South Wales election prediction?
Yeah, I think there'll be a change of government. There's a mood for change there. So it's, talk to people. There's this sense in Sydney in particular at the moment, where I've spent, where I live, that the government's tired, that people are ready for change. And
they've built a lot though, haven't they? I mean, you go out in the streets of Sydney and you look at the amount of projects the coalition government delivered. It's a decent argument. Yeah,
but if you catch light rail and the train's cracked, if you catch the ferries and you know that some of them don't fit under bridges, there's a real frustration with competence of the government that's out there.
Okay, I wouldn't expect anything else. Now, the Reserve Bank and the rate rise, are you hoping this is the last one?
Well, we always want to make sure that cost of living is the best possible situation for people. Obviously, the bank's got a job to do, but we've got a job to do as well. And there are some issues with cost of living that government can influence, some that are outside your control. So the actions of the Reserve Bank, they independently, international factors can't deal with that. You can deal with cheaper medicines, you can deal with cheaper childcare, you can do what we did last year in terms of putting some constraints on what happens with energy prices, and you can act to get wages moving, and all of those actions are ones that we've taken.
Well, at the AFR Summit today, Frank Calabria, the head of Origin Energy, said, despite your measures, power prices are going up by 20% in July. Is that what you're expecting?
Well, you have a look at the forward projections as to what it's meant for wholesale prices in terms of what it would have been were it not for the measures that they took, and there's no doubt that it's making a big difference. And that's not
people are still going to cop it though, aren't they?
We said at the time that there wasn't an action available to us that would make us completely immune from what's happening internationally, but to put some restraint on it doesn't just make a difference for what happens in household expenditure, it also makes a difference to jobs. There's lots of jobs that are dependent on the gas price in terms of the whole operation being productive.
How do you think the super thing's played out? Have you got away with that one as a broken promise?
I think the public know that it's a modest measure. They know it's 0.5% of the Australian population affected by it. And they also know we were left with $1 trillion of Liberal debt. So if the government did nothing, if the government just said, no, we're going to let debt just stay where it is, I think there'd be an understandable frustration from people.
This is really addressing just a fraction of that debt, though, isn't it?
It's a modest measure. It's a modest measure, which is why I'm surprised that the opposition have decided to rail against it. Of all the hills to die on, 0.5% of the Australian population's an odd one, but that's where they've landed.
Do you think the Treasurer and the PM will want to tinker with the Stage 3 tax cuts next year?
No, we haven't changed our position.
You're not expecting a change in the position?
Well, I'm not. We haven't changed our position. That's where we're at.
I wanted to ask about this intervention you've staged in this McDonald's case assisting the SDA. You're a former union organiser of the SDA. Was this down to your ministerial discretion or did it have to go through some other process?
You get requests about intervention come to you all the time, and my process is always the same. You ask the department for advice. If the department says that they think an intervention's appropriate, then you then also cross-check with the Attorney-General. The intervention we're making, though, doesn't really comment on how much might or might not be owed in terms of an underpayment by McDonald's. What it's about is, if a payment's owed, should workers get all the money or should some of the money go to lawyers? And effectively, there's two claims at the moment against McDonald's, one organised by a law firm, a litigation firm, and they've got their model. I'm not saying that, critical that that model exists, but effectively there are two proposals as to how you deal with the underpayment claim. Under the union claim, workers would get 100% of what the court decides they're owed. Under the one run by the law firm, a fraction, however much, I've speculated it could be up to 25%. The company have disputed a number of things I've said, but not that. But no matter what, under any model there with litigation, the workers won't get 100% of the money, and that's the issue that the government's concerned about.
Sure, but this is your old union. If it wasn't your old union, would you be doing this? And they've also donated $1 million to federal Labor in 21-22.
I think it'd be a terrible situation if workers missed out on getting 100% of what they claimed because of where I worked for 6 years, 20 years ago. Are we?
But they would have backed you into the New South Wales Parliament as well, that union.
That argument, no, but the follow through the argument that's just been put, and I'm glad you've put it to me because others have tried to do it indirectly. But
yeah, I'm putting it straight on.
Yeah, the consequence of that argument would be that retail workers would be punished.
Well, how many other cases have you intervened in so far?
Oh, there's one other where there's an intervention at the moment. And
what union's that involve?
That's TWU, that one.
Okay. They're pretty powerful in New South Wales as well.
But similarly, the issue is whether or not, like if the department comes back and advises me, no, you shouldn't intervene on it, then that's the answer. And ministers intervening on industrial decisions that are before the courts is really common, but there is a difference between how I've been intervening and what happened for the previous nearly 10 years. Previous government did intervene. They intervened to try to cut the back pay that casuals might be owed. Okay. They intervened to try to cut the allowances that shift workers would be eligible for.
All right.
There's a list as to where they intervene.
All right. Forget that. Let's talk about you. How much is intervening in this case going to cost taxpayers?
Oh, that information hasn't come to me, but you do as much of it in-house as you can. But the ultimate cost and the principle here, if we end up with a situation, and it's for the court to work out the legalities of this, but if we end up with a situation with all the conversation about wage theft that's been out there, that the outcome is workers don't get what they're owed and lawyers end up always getting a percentage of the money, that's a shocking outcome. And I don't want to see us get there. All
right, we're nearly out of time. I wanted to ask about the PM's trip to India, and well, more specifically AUKUS actually. It looks like an eye-watering amount of money to spend on subs, $100 to $200 billion is what's been speculated. Can the budget take that?
Every government should start with national security as your first decision. Your first obligation to the Australian people is the security of the nation. And you always start with that. You have to deal with economic security and then you have to deal with all the other issues after that. So on anything about national security, the first question is this sensibly required for national security?
All right.
All the advice we have is that it is.
And finally and briefly, Paul Keating got stuck into this Sydney Morning Herald front page on China and preparing for war. What was your view of that, his comments?
Oh, Paul's always had his own views in terms of foreign affairs. He's free to put those views, and on a whole lot of issues, people listen to Paul. He's got a great turn of phrase in terms of how he puts it. But that said, he's got a different view to the government in terms of a number of issues about national security.